Thank you, everybody, for attending this talk. I just want to quickly introduce myself. I'm Arun Vishwanath. I'm a faculty at the University at Buffalo, and most recently, I'm also a faculty associate at Harvard's Berkman Klein, where Bruce Schreiner is. So looking forward to working with him this year. I want to give you a little bit of a background of what I do, what I've been doing for the last decade and a half of my life. For a while now, as an academic researcher, my focus was on how hackers, terrorists, cyber terrorists, call them what you may, affect breaches, and how they do this by compromising people. All right, and I've been working in this area of technology use, technology adoption for close to more than a decade. Put out a lot of publications. I don't want to bore you with the list, but there's a long list which basically only the academic community cared about. For the longest time, my paradigm of working was to actually create attacks and to study why people fell for different kinds of attacks, be they social engineering attacks, be they different kinds of spoofs and breaches and so on and so forth. My focus was on doing these attacks and studying why, answering that why rather than just showing that it can be done. Like I said, I spent a lot of my time doing that, and most of those work was for the academic community, and no one really cared much about it outside of that community. Then, I like to say, came Kim Jong-un. And what Kim did, thanks to Seth Rogen's movie about him, was, he decided to breach Sony Pictures. And suddenly, thanks to that breach, there was now a real visible outcome that people started seeing. There were jobs, people were losing their jobs, millions of dollars were being spent in trying to remediate these breaches. And suddenly, I was all over the place. Started writing on CNN quite a bit, and at every point along this way, I started trying to tell people to stop focusing on the breach and the salacious gossip that was coming out, and start looking at what this really meant. And each breach, starting with Sony Pictures, followed by Ashley Madison, followed by Target, followed by OPM, followed by infrastructure attacks, they kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And I kept writing about this, and for a long time, I was the only one trying to build attention to how these breaches were happening, let alone saying, hey, we got a problem here. And the problem is we got to start studying these users and understand how these guys are getting into these networks. Let's not look at the outcome alone. Let's look at the how, right? And we had the DNC hack. And this seems to be an ongoing process that is never ending. With all of these, one of the common threads that was weaving through this was spear phishing. And spear phishing is something I'm going to talk about today, although my research looks at other types of breaches as well. But spear phishing was starting to get everywhere. It was kind of so common that almost 3/4 of all breaches were using this particular vector. So this became the most favorite vector out there when it came to affecting breaches, when it came to getting a foothold into a network. And these guys were hitting every industry. Thanks to people like Kim Jong-un, Putin, every hacker out there, every hacktivist out there, breaches were everywhere. We thought education was not getting breached. By 2016, 2017, education was getting hit. Every industry was starting to get hit with spear phishing attacks. And what you constantly saw was that the attacks were getting more and more consequential. So in Sony Pictures, you had the leak of emails. In Target, there was leaks of passwords, and it kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And every time when you looked at the cost of remediation, it was keeping on going up. Just to give you an example, last month in Buffalo, New York, where I am, we had a hospital that was hit by a ransomware attack. They refused to pay the ransom. They spent $15 million in remediating that attack, which lasted for all of like a month. So the hospital networks were all down for a month. People are losing their jobs, things are getting more consequential, and arguably, even the ransomware attacks, now we still don't know exactly how these came in, but spear phishing had a hand or something to do with the passage of these attacks. And if we just track the scope of these attacks, the speed with which they've been happening, we had 300,000 infections in 150 countries in less than 48 hours. And I wrote a piece about this on CNN saying this is the first global technological pandemic that we had. And this was a huge deal because now the paradigm has changed. It's global, and if this were a disease, every one of us would be really, really more concerned about this than we are. And so everybody is on this though, right? Everybody's perpetrating this. You have hacktivist groups out there, you have the PLA working there, you have the Russians doing it, you have local guys doing it, and all along, the target is the user, right? The employee in the organization, the end user out there. They have become the weakest links. And we like to say this all the time. You're the weakest link. You're the weakest link. So what do we do about these weakest links? I mean, that's what I'm going to talk about today. So in general, there are essentially three approaches that almost every organization out there or everybody out there who cares about this all over the world, and I've worked with people in the EU, I've worked with people in Asia, in Singapore, and there's basically three approaches that it comes down to, and I call it the 3 C's. The first C is a technical approach, right? Containment. So we've tried to contain people within their networks. This is how we deal with users. The second C is where we try to constrain them, right? This is also a technical approach, right? We air gap, and all of these are relatively successful. There's not one answer here, although everybody's looking for that one answer. These have all been relatively successful. The third approach, the one I'm going to talk about, and I just want to talk real quick about how successful these approaches are. People find workarounds, okay? This is the constant problem with users today. Everybody's constantly trying to be one step above security folks. And when I talk to the security folks, they're constantly lamenting how users are not paying attention, not listening, trying to find a workaround. And I know of people who work in government in security who don't do patch upgrades or don't upgrade their OS on their mobile devices because their children are watching Netflix on it. And they don't want to do an OS upgrade because it's going to stop their ability to watch. So, I collect these stories and I talk about what challenges out there when it comes to dealing with users. So the third approach, which is what I'm going to talk about today, is awareness training. All right? And there is an industry out there now worth close to $1 billion of various awareness, education, training programs that we're constantly hitting people with. Okay, this is right now one of the most popular, perhaps the most proactive approach out there when it comes to dealing with the user, the weakest link in our networks. And this is called the convincing approach, right? We try to convince users. And broadly, this approach takes one of two forms. The first form is what I like to call as didactic training. Didactic training is where you get the user in, you focus your energies on teaching them how to do things better, how to be safe, how to use email safe. There are programs out there, companies out there that do this. This is a focused approach. You spend a day, maybe a couple of days, trying to train them to get smart, to be like us, to be cyber secure, resilient, and all that stuff. Some of this is done on an onboarding basis, but this is an approach that's out there quite a bit. The second approach is what is the embedded training approach. And what is this? This is where you're teaching people by making them make mistakes. And I'm going to talk about both of these approaches, and I want to talk about what we have seen when it came to the success of these approaches, because there really isn't much data out there about how successful each of these approaches are, other than the data coming from the software, the companies, the training companies that are putting them out. So, I'm very skeptical about that data sometimes. So the first one, didactic training. This is that focused training that we spend a lot of money doing. When you look at the overall success, some of the academic research on this comes from around 2004, 2005, so it's a little dated. And one of the first studies, this is a very highly, commonly cited study, was done at the U.S. Army Institute at West Point. where basically what they did is they took about 500 US military cadets, they trained them for about a day, and then they fished them a week later. And what they found is, by the end of 24 hours, they had forgotten the training. They all fell for it. All right? 80% of them fell for it. Very high numbers, very problematic. Now again, this is 2004, 2005. So my research team and I, we decided to replicate this. We said, let's do this, but let's do this right. Let's do this with a different control group. And so we did this study. We took a large financial company in the United States. It's a pretty large company. We took about 400 of its employees who are all from the same, who are all playing the same role in the organization. They're distributed across the United States. We took half of them and we trained them using off-the-shelf software that I will not name, very highly rated. And then we fished them 4 weeks later. And one of the things that we did is we checked to see that we didn't fish them every day. We fished them on 3 non-consecutive days. And there's a lot of reasons for it. Some of the literature, some of the data that we see is it depends on which day that attack comes in. Like for some reason, people are just more likely to click on things on a Friday as against on a Monday because it's the first day of the week. And so on and so forth. So we wanted to get that data right. And we fished them on 3 non-consecutive days. And what you quickly start seeing is when you look at day 1, and I'm just going to show you the day 1 data. By the way, this is the attack we used. This is a very simple attack. We just copied a Google Drive page, and just we sent that attack out, okay? When we sent this attack out, we were looking at some of the data that's out there. Verizon's data breach investigative reports, they talk about 50% of all clicks happening within the first 24 hours, or within the first hour, actually. And when we looked at our data, it matched that. So within the first 24 hours, the vast majority of the clicks were happening very, very quickly. People would just, it didn't matter. It was a Monday and they were just hitting it. This was very interesting because we had 2 groups in this. We had a group that was highly trained and a group that was not trained. And so when we looked at the people who were highly trained, it was absolutely identical. With a little bit of a difference, it was statistically the same. In other words, the training was not really having the effect that people think that it is, right? So we were saying, wait a minute, didactic training doesn't seem to really do it. Although, when we looked at the final data, about 32% of the people who were trained clicked, 35% of the people who were not trained clicked. Okay, so there was a big 70% that didn't do anything. So that's good news, but 35% is a lot. Okay, 35% is real bad news if you look at it that way, but the training effect was marginal. Actually, it was non-significant. It didn't matter. So in other words, do something. Train, don't train, you're going to get the same results, at least when it comes to didactic training, from what we looked at. Okay? So we said, okay, let's look at embedded training. So what is embedded training? This is the more popular training. This is what's out there. Today, many companies, many of you probably work in companies that actually do this, right? This is the kind of training where you test people, right? And you constantly test them, and then every time, so basically, you have a person in the company who does a phishing test, right? Some of you sitting here do that. You faced this test. You get this test, you repeat this test often enough at varying intervals, and then every time you click on a link, something pops up and says, hey, wait a minute, you just clicked on a link, you got phished, right? You're the weakest link, and here's why, and we train you. And this is an interesting approach, and if you fall for the fish once, they train you. In some companies, you fall repeatedly, they warn you. In some companies, they embarrass the hell out of you. There's a lot of different approaches to this. That's, it's open territory, what you want to do to make this stick. But this is the approach that's more common out there. This is more popular. Most companies buy into this. I call it, trying to learn to drive by making mistakes. So, you'll try to learn to drive, you throw a stop sign, you then show different signs. This is like trying to learn driving, and you keep on doing this till the person becomes an expert driver, right? Hopefully at some point, this person's not going to have accidents anymore. That's the approach. It's a great approach. I think it works to some extent. So how effective is this? Mirror did a study. This is from 2015. This is a commonly cited study, and we wanted to replicate it. So in the Mirror study, they did 3 trials. So they did 3 different attacks on about 1,500 people. They found that 35 to 60% of the people fell for the attack regardless of the training. So once again, the training did not have an effect. What was interesting about their results is they found 3 groups. One group, all clickers, they click on anything that's out there. All right, 11%, that's a big 11%. It's really problematic. If you're in InfoSec, you're like, Jesus Christ, that's a lot. You have the 22% non-clickers who don't click on anything. Now, if you're a security guy, you're like, wow, that's good. But if you're in a company that's looking at productivity, what are these guys doing? They're probably not even opening email. I don't know what's going on there. My problem as an academic, I look at that random 67%. And I say, we're screwed. We have no explanation for that. We don't know what these guys are doing. They're just randomly clicking on things. If I know you click on everything, I can take you aside. If I know you don't click on anything, I can say, all right, this person's not a security risk. But if you don't click on anything and you're just randomly doing stuff, I got to figure out what's going on. So we looked at some of this data ourselves. We looked at a company that provided us some of this data, their data. So this was a company that provided data of 20 spear phishing attacks over a 2-year period. So we upped the game quite a bit. From 3, we went to 20. And this is a popular spear phishing program out there, right? Anti-spear phishing program. Each of them were followed by embedded training, popular product, which you've probably heard of, and these were the results we got. And here, the results are a little bit better, but they're still very problematic. If you look at that second column there, 24% of the people were clicking on at least one attack. And this was over a 2-year period of 20 trials. So if you do the math there, around 30% of the people in this company, after 2 years of being hit repeatedly, were still clicking on links. In other words, still falling for a spear phish. After spending all that money, all that time, all that energy, we're still not getting where we want to be getting. And when you talk to CISOs and the InfoSec people who are running this show, they're always perplexed. They're annoyed by this. They'll say things like, I can't believe these guys. We train the hell out of them. They don't get it. They'll say things like, we should fire these guys. Admiral Rogers at the NSA said we should court-martial people who fall for a spear phishing test. We should embarrass them. Some people shame them out. If you're a little bit of a pessimist, you start saying things like, we need to learn to accept that people are always going to be a problem. If you're an optimist, you start saying things like, I think we can just keep doing this and it'll get better, right? We've gotten to 65%. Maybe we just keep on doing it, and then they get better over time and get better over time and better. Unfortunately, if we really want to solve the problem, we got to stop just saying people fall for an attack and that over time it's going to get better. We got to figure out why. Why is this happening? Right? As Alex Tamos yesterday said, we're very good at showing that there is a problem, but we're not very good at explaining or correcting it. And to correct it, we got to get to the how or the why. Why are people falling for it? And the answers are important because right now, the cost of training is expected to increase the most. It's exceeding any other form of technical solution. So if you looked at the 3 C's, containment and constrainment is actually far more inexpensive compared to training. Training is going to exceed all of these costs. And we don't even factor in the time lost in training, the ineffectiveness of some of these approaches. And so when you look at the answers, though, the answers are right in front of us. So one of the things we did is we did our studies where we phished people repeatedly. And unlike other studies, we went to the bottom of why. And when we asked the questions, the answers were right there. People would say things like, I clicked on it inadvertently, without thinking. Or they would say things like, I clicked because it was the week before Halloween, so I got a Halloween phish. I clicked because it seemed very suspicious, so I emailed the person back. Very rational answers, actually, if you really think about it. Or they would say something like, I didn't think it was a big deal. So I'm just clicking on a goddamn link. do it all the time. I was careful to open it on my phone. These answers actually tell us a story. And the story it tells us that what we think of as a people problem is not really a people problem, it's an understanding of people problem. We don't get it. We haven't spent time answering the why. And so one of the things we did, and when I say we, my research team and I, is over a period of the last decade, we've been constantly doing these tests, but we've been trying to come to the answer of why, so that we can build an understanding of why these things happen and how do we make things better. And that's what I'm going to talk about right now. So why do people fall for spear phishing? What does our research tell us? The first thing that we ought to understand is all the people out there in companies today who are constantly phishing people using these phishing software to try to make people more resilient, you got to have a mechanism to understand what's a good attack. Because if I keep phishing you every day or every month, 20 times over a period of 2 years, and I keep varying the attack and make attacks look very complex or very easy, make it so easy for you that you fall for it, make it so complex that you never fall for it, I need to be able to tell you what's a good attack, what's the standard of a decent attack. And for that, we realized that there were only basically 3 things that we needed to understand. And what we call that is there's a model that we developed called the Suspicion Cognition Automaticity Model, called SCAM. It's a published peer-reviewed piece. And we started by looking at what's a good attack. And we came up with a triad. And the triad, we used a word called Vishwas, which is a Sanskrit word for trust. It's a trust triad. The trust triad, the Vishwas triad. And it consists of 3 parts, right? What you need is a trusted source. So a good phishing attack has a trusted source. And there are tons of trusted sources out there, right? Google's a great trusted source. Amazon's a trusted source. PayPal's a trusted source. You need a modifiable field. You have to have a field in that attack that is so easily modified, and it's constantly something that gets modified to the end user. So the end user is not paying that much attention to it. And you can see it right here. This is a good attack. We modified the URL. We modified, the provider name. And a good attack has a 3rd part to it. And that is some kind of user routine, some kind of user expectation. If we could get these 3 things right, we can match the user to the attack, I can get into any network. And when we have done this, we can get a 50% success rate if you can get a good enough trustable provider and do this. So here's an example of Gizmodo's test. Now, if you guys have been watching, reading the stories on this, Gizmodo did a non-scientific test where basically they sent a phishing email to 15 people in the Trump administration. And what they found is roughly half of them clicked on the link. In fact, 2 people responded to the phish. Okay? Now, was it a good attack? Yes. Look at what they did. They took an attack from a very credible source, a trustworthy source, a modifiable field, and what do people do when they get a Google Documents link? They click on it. User routines. All these people expected it, so the 50% success rate. On the other hand, if you did an attack like this, in those 20 attacks that we reviewed from the company that I was talking about, one of them was this. 0.2% success rate. Of course, there's nothing here. You got to be crazy if you click on this, right? But one person did, so. But we use this, right? And the bad guys out there are very smart about it. They use it. So this was the letter I got because of the Anthem attack, giving me credit monitoring. Just to give you an idea, this attack happened, I think in February. I got this letter in November by mail because they were being very careful. But the next day after the attack, I got this. And what do you think everybody was doing? They were all clicking on that because it was something people expected. Nobody thought Anthem would wait 9 months to send you a letter. That's a good attack. And there are many such attacks that we see, and if we can compare the good attacks, we can understand what's going on. The second part was understanding why people click. So we understood that there's something about the attack that we need to match to the user expectation. Then we were looking to see, what is it about people? Like, can we come up with a quantitative model where I can say, you know what, here are a few things that you need to measure. And we have done this over a period of 5 to 6 years, doing repeated attacks all over the world, within companies that have allowed us, given us permission to do this, within university settings. And we realized that there's basically only 3 things that we needed to measure. One was there something that triggered the end user's suspicion? The second was there was something about how that person was thinking. And the third was there was something about how that person was doing. And if we could capture these 3 things, we can actually predict who's going to fall for an attack before we send that fish out. So that was the goal of this process that we engaged in. And so I'm going to quickly explain to you what each of these things really mean, right? So first things first, I'm going to talk about cognition, right? What we found is how do users think becomes pretty important. And what do users do? Users are cognitive misers. What's a cognitive miser? They're not spending time thinking. They're making the fastest decision with the least amount of information and the least amount of effort. All right? And so they use cognitive shortcuts. There's a huge body of published literature on this. And the cognitive shortcuts people use are triggered by something in that email. Generally a logo, a trust indicator. Something that quickly tells me, what is this that I have to do, and I'm going to do it. And if it's part of my routine, I'm just going to do it. Here's an example. Every time I go to Starbucks, I get to click on a link. The Starbucks logo gives me credibility. So we tried this attack, and we found it was very successful. For some reason, people thought Starbucks and Google, because they're part of that same Google Fiber thing, people gave us their logins and passwords. It's very easy to do. Right? Because they're using a shortcut, and we took advantage of that shortcut. And our success rate was around 60%. And there are many examples of this. Here's an example. We created 4 different Facebook pages. And for those of you out there, you can see there's a missing E, there's a different color, there's a missing E and a different color, and then there's the original login page. Which one do you think is the most credible here? Anybody? Which one do you think you would open or put in your login and password? Anybody? This one? Does everybody think it's this one? Right, this one is the most credible, isn't it? Would you put your login and password in here? I wouldn't. All of them are spoofs. Right? How difficult is it to do this? I just copied and pasted the whole thing. Right? So if you're using a shortcut and you're trying to outthink the process, I can outthink you, because without a URL, you don't know what's going on here. Right? So, but what we realized, which is pretty interesting, was this never mattered. Neither did this, because we did this study in October, and a lot of people said, oh, we thought it was Breast Cancer Awareness Month, and they changed their color. I don't even have to work hard at this. It's easier to be a bad guy because people just give you their data. The other thing we were measuring, what do people believe? And this is a real interesting data. And I can tell you this, we've done this, we've asked these 2 questions now in Asia, we've asked it in the United States, we've asked it in Europe, in different parts of Europe. And I can predict the answer. The first question we ask is, how easy is it for you to spot a spear phishing email? And these are employees, 600 employees in a company. And everybody thinks, somewhat easy, very easy, I can do it, I'm pretty good at this. And then we ask them a follow-up question, how easy is it for any other employee in your company to do this? Look at this. Everybody is a ninja in their mind. Right? Everybody thinks they're better than everybody else. And this data is so predictable. We did this exact same thing in the Netherlands. Same answers. How easy is it for you? Somewhat easy. How easy is it for somebody else? Somewhat difficult. And then when you look at the training data and you say, how much time did this person really spend looking at your training? Some of them are spending less than 30 seconds on it. because they're geniuses. They know this stuff. They don't take it seriously. That's a big problem, right? You need to be able to convince this person to first pay attention to what we're giving them. The other thing, and this is something a lot of us suffer from, is what I call the Dunning-Kruger effect. I don't know if you guys know what Dunning-Kruger effect is, but this is a real story. This happens in Pittsburgh. I know you're from Pittsburgh, and there was a guy by the name of MacArthur Wheeler, real name, who broke into a bank. And before he broke into the bank, he applied lemon juice on his face, because he had read somewhere that lemon juice makes you invisible, because it makes ink invisible. So he figured the digital cameras, he's going to be invisible to it. I can't make this stuff up, okay? That's how real the story is. So when they caught him, he kept saying, how the hell did you guys catch us? And he said, well, you were on the camera. I said, how did the camera catch me? I had lemon juice on my face. So two of these guys, Dunning and Kruger, wrote a paper about this. And they said, what makes people think that way, right? There has to be a hubris about us or a lack of knowledge. And we did the same thing with technology, with cybersecurity. And what we found is people have ideas in their mind. All of you do. I do. You ask the end user out there, what's a safer document, a PDF document or a Word document? Invariably, 80% of them will pick PDF. Ask them why. Well, I can't edit it, which means it's safe. Right? We think we know. And there are lots of this, right? When you ask people, what's a safer email client? What's a better operating system? What's a better Wi-Fi network? And what's more secure? Everybody in their mind is carrying these ideas of security, most of which are not based on fact. And the problem with that is, with these risk beliefs, people who have low risk beliefs tend to be very confident. So you think you know, when you really don't know. And no one's told you don't know yet. So you go about doing what you're doing. And that's how you get the MacArthur Wheeler effect, right? You wear a helmet and you stand on top of a tightrope because you think the helmet's going to protect your head. Because that's all that matters, right? Your head. But the problem is you don't know what's the risk there. And so this is a problem, right? This is something that we've been trying to measure. The other is habits. Automaticity. People have habits. And this is checking email and checking email when you're walking, when you're talking. And a lot of these things make you click on things when you're not really thinking it through. You're doing it really fast. And what we have found is it's easier for me to get you to click on a link if you're on a mobile device. It's a lot easier for me to do that. Okay? So we put these things together, right? We put these 4 ideas together and said, let's try to measure this and come up with the best ways of measuring this. And we realized all we really needed to measure when it came to this was a few different things. And this is an empirical model. And it basically consists of 5 or 6 different constructs. And we have a measure for it. Okay? And this measure is what we call as a cyber risk index. So what we found is, if I can ask you questions, basically comes down to 40 questions, we're able to come up with an individualized score that ranges from 0 to 100 that tells me your risk, your likelihood of clicking on one of these spear phishing links. Okay? It's an individualized score, so each person gets a score, and you can use that score and change it and get it updated over time. So it's not a static score. And all you need is a person to answer 40 questions in a survey. Okay? And it's very quick to do. And you can do this using whatever software you're using. So if you're using a package right now to, an embedded training package, you can phish people, do the survey, and then phish them again and see if the data works out. So we've been able to do this to match and to refine our measurement. To say, how good is this? And then we've been able to now aggregate it across divisions. So I can take the score, just like a credit score, and make a risk score for that division, for that group, for all the employees in that area. Because right now, there is no metric out there. right? Just saying how many people fell for a phishing attack or a simulation doesn't do it. We need to be able to say why, and we need to be able to say what's the quantitative threshold here. And so what we have done is we've then come up with mechanisms of taking that index and the answers it gives us. So the index not only gives me a number for each person, it tells me why you're going to fall for that attack. So in other words, is your risk beliefs problematic? The index tells me, okay, here's where that number is coming from primarily. It's coming from their risk index, or it's coming from their risk beliefs. That way, when I'm training you or whatever I'm trying to do, that change can be focused on the problem rather than basically just keeping on hitting you with more and more simulated attacks. And we have done this where we have developed a flow and we said, okay, what is the index telling us? What is this person suffering from? So the analogy I use is if you go to the doctor, the first thing the doctor does is he diagnoses you. And what our 40 questions help us do is it helps us diagnose what's ailing the patient. Because right now the approach is you go to the doctor, he throws a pill at you. You take the pill, you come back sick, he throws more pills at you. And then you keep on doing that, and then you keep blaming the patient for not getting better. It doesn't work. On the other hand, we're able to pinpoint why and then say, okay, here are the answers. And for some people, they may be bad habits that they have come up with. For other people, it may be their risk beliefs. For some other people, it may be a combination of factors. And now, I can come up with a solution based on what that person ails from. Okay? And that's how we're using this index. What is really interesting is when we did this across companies, and we're still collecting data on this, we're still trying to refine it and make it better and make it sharper. What we found is that there is a tipping point to that 0 to 100 number. Okay? There is a tipping point to it. And the tipping point is around 68 to 75. So you have a score from 0 to 100. When you get between 68 and 75, what we find is that people's resilience actually goes up. Right? So we've actually studied this, we've actually implemented this and looked at it. And what we notice is for people whose scores are above that threshold of 68 to 75, you start phishing them, they don't fall for it anymore. Okay? So the job, the way we look at it, is we want to bring people in companies to get beyond that 68 to 75 threshold. Does that make sense? So that's our index. And right now what we're doing is we're trying to figure out ways in which we can refine this even better. Right? We're trying to make it such that it becomes easier to implement it because all it is 40 questions. And it gives you a diagnostic that is, agnostic to the device. So for instance, a lot of training today is within a use case that is very limited. So you're training people to work in a Microsoft environment and in a desktop environment. Many of these environments are changing and don't even exist anymore. Many people are bringing devices to work. Many people are in different OS environments. And whatever training we're doing is so siloed, so limited, and yet so ineffective at times that what we need is to move beyond just looking at the technology to the person, the actor behind that machine. And that's what we're trying to do here. All right? I think we're running out of time. So I'm going to stop here and hopefully take some questions if anybody has any questions. How much? 10 minutes? Oh, so we have about 10 minutes. So if anybody has any questions, yes.
Okay. Yes, I have a question.
I'm sorry.
The cyber risk index, is it peer reviewed and is it being used in practice in the industry? And
so
what are you seeing as it relates?
Right. So this data is all coming from companies right now. The index is still it's in review right now. But the model that's using to come up with this is already peer reviewed and it's available to the public.
Okay. So the 40 questions, is that available to the public also?
The 40 questions are in that instrument, but we are refining it. Okay. And as it gets better, we're gonna just put it out there so people can use it.
Okay.
All right.
My question is about empirical results with actual intrusions. So is there any data coming back from these companies where instead of a simulated phishing attack, it was an actual phishing attack, and seeing how the CRI of the employees are lining up against where there's a real intrusion?
As yet, there isn't any, to be honest. So as yet, the only way we're doing this is we're using the existing pen testing methodology, and we're using our approach to give them the index and trying to see if the pen test data matches it. But unfortunately, we don't, even that data is really hard to get. I mean, that seems to be the bigger problem. And to answer the peer review question, I mean, we're going through, the bad guys out there are attacking us every minute, and my peer review cycle is 6 months to a year. So, by the time I get this thing through the process, I mean, we're a year down the process. The bad guys have already hit us like 10 other times or 100 other times successfully. Yes?
Yeah, sorry, just kind of out of curiosity, to me it's confusing why 76 to 100 would not be better for a CRI score. And as an example on this chart here, what's with that green bar on the far right? What's that? Is that little guy just like an outlier? Or?
It was just, they're outliers. So the problem with working with people, as you know, is we don't get perfect data. I wish we could, right? I wish we could get that hard data, right? 2 molecules of hydrogen and 1 molecule of oxygen always makes water. With people, unfortunately, it's not. And so we're going to have outliers on both sides. So here you have a bunch of people with lower scores on this side, also not getting phished. So it's not very clean, and that's why the more data we get, the better this gets. But on average, what we're finding is once you get beyond 75, these guys are very resilient. Okay, once we get to that threshold, and this is pretty compelling. Once you get below it, we're in a whole world of trouble. Okay, and that helps in itself. Yes?
Looking at other types of security behavior, like employees making choices about how to handle customer data and stuff like that?
Right, and so one of the things we're doing is we're trying to predict what I like to call cyber hygiene, but within an organizational setting, it's about handling PII more hygienically, for lack of a better word. So we're working on it. The issue is, again, we're still collecting data to make this much more robust than it is. How much it applies across the board, we still don't know, because that's where the training comes in. So if you can train people better and train them based on some of this, at least you have a metric that you can fall back against. Okay? Yes?
I just want to point out something that it looks like you discovered inadvertently that's really cool. You were collecting information on why people clicked the link after they did it, and you found some interesting information. Some people were suspicious of it before they clicked it, but it seemed like they just didn't know what to do with that link. So I'm thinking that something that companies could do to be more resilient is they can tell the employees what to do if they're suspicious, because they might not know like who to go to or who to send it to. And then instead of all this negative reinforcement, like you got to embarrass or punish them, you can start doing positive reinforcement, like rewarding or recognizing people that discovered the vulnerability or the attack before it got widespread.
Right, and that's a great point, right? So we got to come up with better mechanisms of reinforcing people. There's a whole part that I didn't talk about. For instance, we have tried different approaches to improve behavior. A lot of behavioral training today misses habits, right? What are people's routines? And so one of the things that we've been working on is how do I make you develop better routines? And part of that routine might be, making you more conscious of using 2FA as often as possible, or multi-factor authentication, of looking at your logs, of emailing problematic emails that you see to somebody in IT, assuming that there is that setup for doing that. And what we find is, some people benefit from that, but not all, right? So you need to be able to say, okay, who benefits the most from a habit intervention? And so again, using our measure, we're able to pinpoint where that CRI is coming from, and then go to that person and train just them. And we're actually doing that. I have some data on that. And we find that within 3 to 4 weeks, you start changing the way these people are thinking about their routines. And one of the actions that we did is we took away their mobile access to email. So we kind of right off the bat said, these people shouldn't have mobile access because their habits are really problematic. And I'll give you some data that is really, really interesting. I can't explain it yet, but there were people who click on links multiple times. I don't know if you guys have seen this in your data set, but we're starting to see this where people are repeatedly clicking on a phishing email link or repeatedly opening an attachment, and it boggles our mind. And one of the things we realized was a lot of the mobile clients that people are using allows you to have the email come back at a later date. So the person's clicking on it and saying, I'm going to come back to this, and then they come back to it, and they come back to it. So you're getting multiple infections from that same person, in theory, and some of these people shouldn't have access to it via email, on their mobile device. So we just took it away, right? So that's one way to think about it. All right? Any other questions?
I'm interested that this study kind of depends on self-reported information. How much data, or is it ever possible to infer some of these behaviors, particularly habitual behavior where you have information on devices? How are you cross-checking that kind of stuff?
So one of the good things about using a lot of these training packages is depending on which one you're using to do your testing, your pen testing, for instance, your red teams or whatever they're using, you can say, okay, how are these people accessing the link? Are they accessing on a mobile device? Are they accessing on a PC environment? How many times they're clicking? So some of the behavioral data we're correlating with the self-report data that we already have. So we've been doing it in multiple ways. We've been doing a pre-post. We've been doing a post-only. So what we're trying to bring this to is 40 questions that we can use regardless of whether you're getting tested or not. So we can just use it across organizations. I mean, that's the standard we're trying to get to, and I think we're getting close. All right? Any other questions? Yes.
My very subjective observation is that sometimes people click on links simply because they're curious.
Right.
Have you explored the role of curiosity in motivating people to open phishing emails?
Well, curiosity is more, it's a very subjective notion, but where we get to that is with our triad, it's expectation. So more often than not, I mean, there are going to be those people out there who are going to click on a link just because, I remember the Israeli Defense Forces were phished. They fell for a phishing attack, which basically said, girls of the Israeli Defense Force. It was a YouTube link that was sent to all of them. And that I would call curiosity. But now if you fall for that in 2017, you got a problem. Right? So we get that 1% who are going to click on pretty much anything. Right? But we got to move beyond that to say, okay, what are the expectations? Hopefully we can protect against the vast majority of this. But if we can find what those expectations are that people have and match it, we have a better deal at stopping it.
Thank you.
Sure. Yes?
Did you have attempt to make a correlation to like age group or functional group within the company?
We did. Age doesn't predict much except at the upper ends of it. It really doesn't. Between groups in the company in terms of what their functions are, we find technical people fall just as well as non-technical. The people who are in InfoSec, they think that they're very smarter than they are. Okay, we all do. And one of the reasons for it, and it's a very simple reason, is there is just so much that we can do to match an attack to you that it's likely I can catch you if I really want to, right? If I'm really motivated, I can do this. And then what we find is repetition helps. So even with highly technical people, if I repeat that attack, the same attack, the likelihood of us getting 15 to 20% is not pretty low. We can easily get that. So we're not seeing big differences in them. Okay?
Follow on to that, do you see more attacks to like the company executives and higher level on the spear phishing?
We haven't done only company executives, but the likelihood is that if you're a company executive. So one of the things that we've been talking about is how do we take this index and figure out who gets admin privileges, like who gets more access to databases, for instance. And what we find is right now the system we have is based on your role. So if you're the CEO, you get access to things which you may or may not need access to. But you force yourself into it. You say, I'm the CEO, I can do this. I need access to the accounting or the billing system. Maybe we don't. But how do you say no? The only way to say no is if you have some quantitative metric that says, you know what, you are too risky for us right now, and maybe you shouldn't be getting access. So that's kind of like where we're trying to take this and say, we need a quantitative metric here of some sort that tells the IT guys out there to say, wait a minute, no, let's come up with an index, let's use this index, and let's give access based on that.
Thank you.
Yes. All right, out of time. Thank you so much. Thanks for coming.